communications manager with the American Numismatic Association, and we are at the National Money Show taking place in Colorado Springs, Colorado at the Broadmoor. The show started yesterday and it's here till Saturday at 4 p.m. So we've got a lot of stuff to look at here. Lots of dealers sharing their numismatic treasures. We have the museum showcase here, and I have Money Museum Curator Doug Mudd with me today, who's going to tell us a little bit about something they have on display here at the National Money Show.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, what we have today is a really special set of items that we recently acquired at the museum. This is part of a collection of the Bank of the United States notes. Now, the Bank of the United States is important historically because it was the first federally chartered bank that became essentially our Federal Reserve back in 1793. Now, this is really early on in our history. This bank basically was where our federal government did its first business. So the bank was the clearinghouse for federal debts, for borrowing, and for bringing in taxes. They would actually handle the money for the federal government and make things a little bit easier for the Treasury. Now, what that meant at this time is the U.S. government did not actually issue money on its own except for coins. Paper money was something different. It was issued by private banks at this time, except for the Bank of the United States, which was essentially, it started out as what you would call a privileged private bank because the federal government used its facilities to handle currency. The problem with the coins is we didn't have enough gold and silver to cover all the needs of the country. So the Bank of the U.S. provided an essential service by producing notes such as a $5,000 note, a large denomination note that could actually meet some of the larger expenses that were needed. Now, the problem was it was a private bank with a federal charter, and there were a lot of congressmen and other banks that thought that was an unfair privilege for them to have access to government money like this. Plus, the problem was it was also the only bank, because it had a federal charter, that was allowed to operate in multiple states. All of the other private banks had to have a charter from a particular state, so they could only operate in that state and issue currency in that state. So they were jealous of this ability to handle nationwide business. They did perform an essential service because they were able to essentially make the job of the government easier by providing cash services, and also they helped keep the other banks in control because government taxes, government bills were paid in private money, private bank money, and what the Bank of the United States did, they became a clearinghouse. So when they received a bill, a note for $100 or for $500 from the Bank of Lafayette, Connecticut or something, the National Bank would, as the Bank of the United States, as the repository for the federal government, they would make sure that that note was redeemed in coins. Because at this time, paper money was not quote unquote real money. Real money was gold and silver. But there wasn't enough to run the economy, so you had to use paper money. But it had to be redeemed at some point. So that's where the Bank of the United States became really important. Now, politically, because of the jealousy, the Bank of the United States operated until basically 1811 on its first charter. They had 20-year charters, and then it was not renewed. The problem was, as soon as Congress refused to renew the charter, the economy went into a nosedive. There was a recession immediately afterwards. So they realized, wait, we've got to do something about this. And in 1816, they renewed the charter, and the Bank of the United States, as the second Bank of the United States, resumed its operations, and the economy recovered. Everything was going pretty well. By the 1830s, however, President Andrew Jackson was very much a free economy sort of guy. He wanted free trade. He wanted bankers. He was supported by a lot of bankers who wanted to do unregulated banking and be able to issue as much money as they wanted, regardless of whatever reserves in silver or gold each bank had. And the Bank of the United States was in the way. They were the ones who were causing problems, and so they wanted to get rid of the regulations. So he refused to recharter the bank in 1831, even though the charter didn't come up until 1836. Martin Van Buren, his successor president, had to deal with the problems of not rechartering the bank. Because they did that, the economy again fell apart, and it's actually created a collectible, the hard times tokens, the tokens that were made by individual businesses, basically trying to make the economy work even though there wasn't enough money going around. What's really neat about this particular display is we have examples of notes from the earliest period, so 1791, all the way up to the last period. These notes are really interesting for a number of reasons. They're fairly crude. They're just printed. There's nothing really fancy on there. The problem with that, and this was true for all U.S. notes at the time, is it's easy to counterfeit. So you'll see the second two of them both have, the first one it's a $10 with bad on it. Well, what that means, it was a counterfeit note. It was noticed, and then somebody wrote on the note bad, so it didn't get circulated again. The next one has X's on it, and it's the same thing. They canceled the note because it was a counterfeit. So that gives you sort of the story of what's going on with that. And then as time went on, you had different types of notes, and then you had increased quality of printing. So you have notes like this $5,000 note with higher quality printing, much harder to counterfeit. So one of the things that you'll notice is that some of the notes have higher quality, and one of the things you see on this 10 and this 50 is there's a much more detailed printing done. They're using basically geometric images on there made by a geometric lathe, which is much harder to counterfeit by hand. So these became a little bit better. You see a little bit of a drop of the counterfeits. But the counterfeits are a big story on their own as well, simply because they tell you, since they circulated, you can see the ones we have did circulate, there was such a need for them that people used whatever they could get their hands on. It created some problems, but we were so desperate for enough money to run the country that counterfeits worked. Now, one of the things that the bank did, as banks have always done, they issued checks. So if you were a depositor at the bank, if you had a savings account or a checking account, you could write checks on it. And we've got a nice series of checks here. Most interestingly is this number 12 and the number 13. Number 12 is a check that was written by Winfield Scott. Now, any of you that know anything about our early military history, particularly the start of the Civil War, General Winfield Scott was the head of the U.S. Army at the start of the Civil War, and he was the one responsible for the Anaconda Plan that eventually was the strategic plan for beating the South. He wrote this check in 1822, and it's amazing because you can see his signature right there on there. It's an autograph of Winfield Scott. He's considered by American military historians to be possibly the best American general historically, the most influential certainly in how the Army, our military, was organized early on. Now, the next one is a much better known historical figure. I mentioned his name earlier. President Andrew Jackson wrote this check. Now, this check is ironic because Andrew Jackson was a strong enemy of the Bank of the United States, and yet he did deposit money there, and he did write checks on it. So it's sort of ironic that the eventual killer of the Bank of the United States actually used their services and wrote a check. But here's a check signed by the not then, but later President Andrew Jackson. And with that, we have one last thing to talk about. Now, these notes are still seen today, particularly this note of the design like this with a 500 on it. There is a $1,000 note that circulates as a copy. It's a copy that was made in the 1970s through basically today. They're still making them today. Now, one of the things we get very commonly is, well, is this a real note? How much is it worth? And the notes actually say that they don't have a closing clause on them, so supposedly they're still good. Well, is that worth thousands and thousands of dollars because of that? Well, no, it isn't. It's a modern copy, and the notes were actually demonetized after the bank closed in the 1840s. After it lost its charter, it became the Bank of the United States, but it chartered in Philadelphia. But it did fail eventually. Well, that question of how much are these notes worth has been going on for well over 150 years at this point. And right here we have a letter from the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. A American citizen sent in a $100 note from the Bank of the United States asking, is this good and can I redeem it? And the Secretary of the Treasury wrote back a note saying, I'm sorry, no, this note has been out of circulation, has not been valid since the 1830s, and returned the note very generously, and somebody actually kept the two together and has enabled us to tell that little story, which is pretty cool. This is an 1877 letter for a note that was issued, 50 years before.
There you have it, a brief overview of the display here about America's first central bank as part of the Money Museum showcase at the National Money Show. The Money Museum actually just opened a new gallery just yesterday called the Americana Gallery. So if you ever have a chance, come on down to the Money Museum in Colorado Springs. Make sure you stop by and see what they have on display. Obviously very extraordinary things, historic pieces here. Lots to look at and see, and thank you, Doug, for going over this with us.
Thank you, Amanda.